Sustainable Development Goals 4 being quality education, and 17 being partnerships for the goals, or as we like to say, collaboration. So welcome. This is a collaborative event, and today we have our very own patron, Professor Mervyn King. And if you are online, please let us know where you're from. In the chat function, we have all of the functions online open today. So there are reactions. If you like what Prof. King is saying, please clap your hands. There's the heart. There's a laughing emoji. Thank you so much. I see Gavin from Dubai is a regular with us. Thank you. And if you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A so we don't miss them. But the chat is open. You can, we have the captions open as well. So if you are from a different language area, you're welcome to set the language to your preference and have the the translations at the bottom of your screen. That's fine. We are recording the event, and the recording will be available on the event page. We are also making the event available as a podcast summary, and we'll have the questions and answers available written on the event page as well. I am so excited to also share with you now a new video about joining our community. So please do take a listen and join the community. I know that most of you are members of our community, but let's just have a quick listen at this video. Let me just try and get all of these things done. Where is the go button now? There it is.
This is why you need to join the Good Governance Academy today. Unlock a community that's transforming governance on a global scale. The Good Governance Academy is a non-profit global organization dedicated to promoting good governance and collaboration. We align with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, focusing on conscious corporate leadership and sustainable value creation. By joining our community, you'll gain access to exclusive events like webinars, workshops, and roundtables featuring global thought leaders. Get personalized event invitations, stay updated with community news, and explore our extensive video library. Plus, collaborate on our ESG exchange to create sustainability reporting playbooks. And the best part, it's all free. So don't wait. Join the Good Governance Academy community today and take your governance game to the next level. Visit goodgovernance.academy. Together, let's create a better world through good governance. This is why you need to join.
Let me stop that. Thank you so much. And the patron himself is here today, and the founder of the Good Governance Academy, Professor Mervyn King. And this is the second part of our series on being a chair, and chairing through today is chairing through strategic transformations. So welcome, Prof. King, and welcome to everybody online. I think if we just kick off, in chairing strategic transformations, I think in today's world, there are so many strategic impacts that are happening organizations, from technology and now cybersecurity and then AI, and even from sustainability and the impact of climate change. So even more relevant in today's world, perhaps, is strategic transformation. But you have a lot of history around chairmanship. Perhaps you can share some of that with us.
Yes, as I've said on many occasions, being the chair of a limited liability company, especially those listed on stock exchanges around the world, which I have been, is not honorific, it's horrific. And it can be very onerous at times. But what you've indicated, Carolyn, is absolutely correct. There's so many issues today that a board has to consider, and so many factors impacting on a company and the company's activities affecting those important factors for sustainable development, namely the economy, society, and the environment. But it makes it more important, the principle, which I've always adopted in chairing a company, is to make sure that the corporate mind of my board, the collective mind, not the individual directors, but the collective mind that's making a business judgment call, is a unified one. So I always have an offline meeting with the directors to agree what is the purpose of the business of the company, what are the value drivers of the business? And I give an example, always FedEx. When they started out, they found that the value driver for them was reliability. If they weren't going to be reliable in delivering parcels and documents, etc., they weren't going to have a business. So they asked themselves the question when they did something, is this reliable? Will it be seen as reliable? So that was a value driver. So what is the value driver of this company we're talking about? Who are our major stakeholders? And do we understand their needs, interests, and expectations? Because we need that to inform us in eventually coming to a business judgment call in the long-term best interests of the health of the company. What are the key risk indicators? What are the key performance indicators? And then what is the culture of the company, which is, I like the American definition, how we do things around here when nobody's watching us, so we agree with that. But then we agree the characteristics of the company, because the external stakeholders look at a company from the outside, and as Sir Adrian Cadbury and I always discussed, and he wrote about in his book of chairmanship, that external stakeholders look at the characteristics of a company. So people look at you, Carolyn, as a South African citizen, that's your culture, but you've got characteristics. And same thing with a company. And then the question is your company, let's assume we're a company listed on the London Stock Exchange, for example, and our major supplier is in Chennai, in India, are they practicing good governance? Are they qualitative governance people from a responsible governance point of view? Because if not, then if it's learned, for example, that they are appointing child labor to reduce expenditure, and that becomes known, the next day on trading on the London Stock Exchange, you, the company of which you're chairman, could lose 50% of its market cap. It has happened. So all these things have to be agreed and in a discussion offline, and you come back into the boardroom and agree them. Now, you need that agreement of the collective mind of the board coming to a decision when you're arriving or dealing with strategic transformation. So you can take strategic transformation of anything, of the question of gender on boards, for example, or whatever it may be. But I would like to deal with something of, in reality, what actually happened with me as chair of the Frame Textile Group, which was the biggest textile group in the Southern Hemisphere at its peak. But what the late Philip Frame did, who was the chair, he, before his death, he drove the company on a basis of never getting rid of old plant and machinery. Now, plant and machinery is a critical factor in producing fabrics and yarns, etc. And there's always something being newly created in, for example, AI intelligence today would be used in creating new plant and machinery. And you have to keep up to date. He didn't. He took old plant and machinery, and in the unfortunate apartheid days, he put it into the so-called homelands, where he got subsidized wages. And so he made a very narrow margin, but he never got rid of the old plant. And he did the same thing in Malawi, Zimbabwe, Zambia. So old plant and machinery went to these places where he got a subsidization for wages, and he made a thin margin. Well, clearly not a sustainable practice or strategy. And when apartheid was coming to an end, it clearly was not sustainable. And I became the chair of the company when it was really in trouble. And I became the chair because I'd been one of the legal advisors to the group and to Mr. Frame himself. And I became a trustee of his trust on his death. And he had said that nothing should be changed in regard to plant and machinery. And he appointed 3 people as joint managing directors who were, with respect to them, naysayers to Mr. Frame and followed whatever he said without question. It's like Mr. Trump these days with these henchmen. And so they would never change plant and machinery. And so the first thing we had to do was litigate to get rid of these 3 joint managing directors, where we succeeded. That took a couple of years. And then the question was, the company was actually manufacturing into stock. So the biggest item for the last 3 years during this litigation on the balance sheet was stock, increasing in value. So we were not selling what we were producing. And we were, with the stock increase, it was problematic because tariffs were being reduced, very similar to the problems executives are facing today, by the then South African government, and the Eastern fabric tigers were pushing their fabrics into South Africa cheaper than we could produce them. So it was a huge problem. So what to do about that? Well, the first thing was the chief executive, and the relationship with the chairman is absolutely critical in these circumstances. Because if you are a listed company, which the Frame Group was, the chief executive can't share confidential information, not even with pillow talk with his spouse, for example, because he commits an offense under the insider trading provisions. His confidant is the chair. And if the relationship between chair and chief executive breaks down, you've got a huge problem. So you go offline. The chair and the chief executive goes offline, which I did, the Frame Group. And we asked, what are the organizational goals that we need to achieve to try and correct the situation? And these were they. It was to close all these factories in the homelands and Blantyre and all over the place, and scrap the old plant machinery, get a whole lot of new machinery and up-to-date machinery. For example, to draw a pattern on fabric, like the blouse you're wearing, was all done by hand, but it became computer-aided by the time I became chair. And you didn't need 17 artists drawing your design of your blouse. It could be done very quickly on a computer-aided system. So all this had to be changed, but the chief executive and I went offline and discussed it. And what are we going to do? What we were going to... Our plan was, and these were the organizational goals, to close these subsidized factories from Blantyre down to Cape Town. Move from 32,000 employees to 4,500 employees. That was the goal. Replace the weaving sheds with absolute modern weaving equipment. Replace the jean fabric situation, which consumed a lot of water, to something that's actually saving water. Then the spinning mills was another issue. We had all these factories in the Durban area, so huge properties we owned in Cape Town, in East London, in Durban, Johannesburg. So in South Africa alone, we had a property empire, but we sold properties in Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and they closed factories. And it took us 2 or 3 years, but we couldn't just retrench people like that. And so we hit on an idea to take one of these huge weaving sheds. Let me try and give people online an idea of a huge weaving shed. It could easily take a Boeing 747 as a hangar, easy. They're huge warehousing factories. And we cleared them of the old weaving plant, put sewing machines down. And as we retrenched people, we offered them a retrenchment package, or they could take a job in sewing a business which was started simple pajamas and T-shirts. And we, the frame group, would supply them with knit fabric at cost price. And one of the leaders of the trade union actually became the managing director of this business called Zenzalini, which is a Zulu word for help yourself. Help yourself. And having worked out these organizational goals, we then went back to the board with them to agree them, and we said it's going to take 4 to 5 years to achieve this. And now it was important to know that I had a unified collective mind board. Now you can see the importance of what I said to make sure of that. And eventually they agreed to it, and I persuaded the banks to lend the group 450 million rand. We notorially pledged the stock, of which we had plenty, the new plant and machinery, which we were about to buy, and of course the immovable properties in South Africa, which were several and huge, and started selling properties and retrenching people from Malawi, Zimbabwe, Zambia, in the homelands. And I was with the frame group for 14 years, and by the time I resigned as the chair, we had paid back the banks everything. We had completely modern and computer-aided machinery. We had people, 4,500 workers. Not that I didn't have death threats, which I did, this organization. But the whole organization was turned around. And when I left, there was, in fact, over 170 million rand in cash in the bank. And creditors all paid, and banks repaid, and the business was trading successfully and trades to this day, but refocused back into Durban, where it was originally from, and everything could be, and we could produce the same quantity of fabric and yarn with a new plant in fewer warehouses, and we formed then a separate property company, which we started dealing with property, letting off property and cutting it into pieces to let off, and offices, etc. So a separate property business in itself. And so these organizational goals were achieved through this strategic transformation. It started with the chief executive and I, who we had a fantastic relationship, agreeing on it, taking it back to the board, discussing it, agreeing to the organizational goals. Now, when you have agreed those organizational goals, you then have to have strategies. So that's the what, but how are you going to achieve it? Now comes the strategic issues. And strategically, we had in our boardroom in Durban a big whiteboard. We had at the top the organizational goals, and then the strategies. And the strategies have to be flexible, because things happen that you couldn't have anticipated in your discussions, and you might need to change things in the strategies going forward. But never stop those organizational goals, your end game, what you want to achieve. You've got to keep those in mind all the time and drive the company to see it. And it takes a lot of pain and suffering, mental and otherwise. And but we did it. and it took 4 to 5 years to achieve it. And so strategic transformation of whatever kind, Carol, be it changing your computer-aided tools in the company, then, well, it takes strategy to do it, but you've made the organizational goal of changing to a company that's, let's say, not computer-aided, which the Frame Group was not, one being computer-aided. And I'm sure today they're using AI tools, which I don't know, but I'm sure they are. So you've got your organizational goals, on top which was to reduce the number of people, close factories outside of the Durban area, form a separate property company for the properties that were left in South Africa, and start a property business, which we did. And so all these organizational goals were achieved, and there were strategies underneath them. And these strategies from time to time were changed. We agreed to change certain things from time to time. But in the end, we achieved our organizational.
Yeah.
So that's an actual example that I lived through. And I always say, I've got several degrees and doctorates and professorships, not only locally, but overseas as well. Nothing that I studied could have taught me what I learned in those 14 years in achieving those organizational goals and dealing with that strategic transformation.
Did you chair Frame Group for 14 years to do that?
Yeah.
Wow, so much stands out for me. First of all, well, you don't have you might have lots of degrees and honorary professorships, but you don't have a degree in textiles and manufacturing textiles. Yeah. So I'm just thinking about the technology requirements and in terms of AI. I don't see today many chairs taking that active interest in, or even understanding the technologies that they are busy transforming. What was the learning curve for you in trying to get your hands around the technology changes in the textiles?
Fantastic. And my chief executive was a very experienced textile man. He was born in Austria and just on the border of Italy. He spoke German, English, and Italian fluently. And I'll never forget when we went to our major plant supply was in Switzerland. And he said, I've got to take you to my favorite restaurant for lunch. Always call me Chair. Chair. I said, okay, Walter, let's go. So we went just across the border. And in those days, I just held up my South African passport and flashed the border into Italy. And we went to this fantastic restaurant looking down over this beautiful lake. And he introduced me to all these wonderful salamis and things at this restaurant. I'll never forget that day. But when we were traveling together and talking to our machine suppliers, who were Swiss, Sulzer, S-U-L-Z-E-R, and they called the new plant of machinery in Durban Sulzerland, because it was all Sulzer plant and machinery. And it was through our organization goals, which we wanted to achieve, actually changed the way some of the machines were made in order to achieve our organizational goals.
Wow.
I had to have an understanding of the making of fabrics and yarn spinning and various things. And so I became a bit of an engineer at the same time. But that's why I say I think you could do 5 MBAs and you wouldn't have learned what I learned, especially those first 4 or 5 years, and then cheering the thing to success. And then
now, the other thing,
starting a private equity business called Bright. But anyway, it's another
yes,
story.
that's another one. But the 14 years, what do you think now of the 9-year limit in terms of, so after 9 years, directors no longer seen to be independent? How would that play into that?
Well, I, at the time, it was a question whether I was chairing the company as a non-executive, but I was working almost on a daily basis with the chief executive. And his agonies and then, of course, some of the other senior executives. So every Monday morning I was on the red-eye flight to Durban, and every Friday night I was on the last flight back from Durban to Johannesburg. And I had a permanent suite at the Maharani Hotel in Durban. And I used to leave my clothes and I used to dry clean and wash them. And I used to travel with nothing, just get on the plane and go to the week. But I was not an employee as an executive chairman, but I went into the office on a daily basis and spoke to this executive and that executive and this and what's happening with this property and what's happening. And they wanted my input. They wanted my comfort. You know, that I would give them the yes, go ahead with that and do this and do that. And because there were things happening every week, as you can imagine, Carrie. And so it was an exciting job for me, and but it was horrific. And as I said, at times I had death threats. I had my tires of my car.
So explain a little bit more about how you went about considering reducing the staff numbers from 32,000 to 4.5.
Well, we did it by getting modern plant machinery that we could produce the same quantity of fabric, but at a cheaper cost of production. And actually became competitive with these Chinese. At the same time, I became chair of the Textile Federation in South Africa and crossed swords with the then Minister of Finance, and on the question of tariffs, that they had to increase the tariff for Far Eastern textiles coming into South Africa and taking jobs away from our people here in South Africa. And that was another thing that I did for years, was fighting government on their policies. So it was a full-time job.
And just the weight of those lives on you must have been, as you say, horrific.
Absolutely horrific. And that's why we thought of Zanzalini, and it worked. And the person we chose, who was a member of the Textile Workers Union, to be the managing director of that a business of making pajamas and T-shirts at fabrics provided at cost, is today a wealthy man and the chief executive of a couple of major companies listed at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange.
So also just helping the people that are impacted as stakeholder considerations, social considerations.
Absolutely. And I was also very aware from working with these people and looking at, I mean, the amount of water that's used in making fabrics is just horrific, Carolyn. And even in those days, the 90s, I was aware that water was a critical issue for South Africa. So we worked with our machine manufacturers in Zurich to actually make this jean fabric machine. We saved 600 liters on every pair of jeans, because it's over 1,000 liters of water to make the fabric for a pair of jeans. So I was aware in the 90s about what I started speaking about, and maybe that was the reason that I was approached by the IID to draw a code when we were going into our democracy. And Mr. Mandela asked me to, and confirmed, and I said to him, I'd been asked to do this, and I'll never forget the discussion with him. He said, do it, you're the right man. Do that.
Because so much experience.
I couldn't bother any more about weighing it up. At the time, I was also the chairman of First National Corporate and Merchant Bank, and I was kind of busy, you know.
Yes. So just a last technical question around that, an executive chair versus a non-executive chair. Um, we read in your codes and reports about the need for an independent chair. What is your thought, and what are those differences and nuances?
Absolutely. I agree with what he said in the codes that you should have an independent chair, and it's in the draft code number 5. Independent director, independent in the sense that you're not a major supplier, you're not a former employee of the company, etc., etc. I agree with that you should be an independent professor, independent chair.
Chair.
But it was an extraordinary turnaround and transformation of that company. And that's why I thought I'd give an actual example for people in mind, that any kind of transformation, strategic transformation, one of the important things is to have that the chair is the confidant. He or she is at the apex. And now it's interesting that the board, we came to the question of closing factories, for example, in a town like Harrismith. Now, we employed 3,500 people in Harrismith. That's virtually the whole of Harrismith, a big factory. Who had to go and talk to the mayor of Harrismith to tell him that we're going to close the factory? And 3,500 people out of 7,000 people living in Harrismith are not going to have jobs anymore.
Must have been
And
horrific, as you say.
the board decided it's the chair.
Of course, it's the chair.
It's the chair. So when I closed the East London factory, I mean, we employed 9,000 people. It had a huge adverse impact on East London. And I learned that to call a formal meeting wasn't the way to go. And I used to have these informal sort of cocktails, and I would stand up and explain why we were doing it, and that how hurtful it was, and how transport yourself into my shoes, that I have to come and tell you that you no longer have a job. And I said, it's not a pleasant experience for me. It's a very unpleasant experience for me. But I have to do it in order to save this company and in order to make sure it carries on, and that those who are employed have longevity of employment. Otherwise, you're going to lose a critical manufacturing arm in the South African business scenario. And none of those closures was easy for me. I think one of the most difficult, funnily enough, was in Blantyre, because the Blantyre company was really suffering from a shortage from a cash flow point of view. And they never had money to buy spare parts, but they were so inventive, those Malawians. They tied, some weaving machines were tied together with leather thongs and things. And it was actually heartbreaking to close that factory, but it had to be done. And the board decided it was the man at the apex, the chair, had to do it. And that's why I started at the beginning to say it's not honorific, it's horrific to be the chair of companies that's going through strategic transformations.
Sometimes another thing that stood out for me was when you were talking and you said you and the CEO worked together, and you determined within the purpose of the organization, you determined the goals, and then you took it to the board. Did the board not feel that you were being a bit autocratic? I mean, the chair and the CEO coming to them and saying, you know.
We came and we had a very open discussion, and you either agree with us or you didn't agree with us. These were the organizational goals, and we agreed that we had to develop strategies from time to time. We had to be flexible in managing those strategies and deciding from a board point of view what those strategies were in transforming the organization. But the organizational goals, it was essential to me that we had this unified, collaborative mind in making business judgment calls. And that's why I started this conversation by saying you need to have that offline discussion to make sure you've got a unified mind in making, because the board is a collective mind that makes that final business judgment call on these strategic transformation issues. And the chair's got to make sure that it's unified on those things. I mean, every director's got its own, their own skills, etc., etc. But you need unification on those critical issues which I outlined at the beginning of my talk.
Did any of the directors give assertive feedback from their perspective, or was it a bit, rollover?
No, absolutely not. There, I had. You must remember, I had on my board the chair of two of the leading law firms in South Africa, Worksmans and Bowman Griffin, it was then now Bowman's, on my board. I had a leading accountant on my board. There were really, it was a strong board, and people asserted themselves, especially the leader of then Bowman Griffin, who was the doyen of one of the doyens of the legal profession in South Africa. So it was a very strong board. And they questioned everything. But we had to come to the board with a plan to transform the thing. But I had to make sure that I had a unified collective mind that was going to apply its mind to make that business judgment call to carry it forward.
Well, something like this, I often see that boards then create like a strategic committee to then oversee strategy, specifically when it's big, large transactions involved, etc. What is your thought about using a strategic committee of the board?
Well, you can do it, but the board can never rubber stamp what the committee decides, because you can delegate, but you cannot abdicate your responsibility. And it's the responsibility of the board, that strategic transformation. And when something goes wrong, notice I didn't say if, when something goes wrong, who's to blame? Not the strategic committee, the board. And so you've got to interrogate what the committee comes with and satisfy yourself. Yes, no, the strategy I think is a good one, bad one, etc. And the board has to approve it, absolutely. But just don't rubber stamp what's brought to you by committees, social and ethics committees, audit committees, whatever. Interrogate, apply your mind, original intellectual thinking, and make that decision in the best long-term interest of the health of the company.
Thank you.
It's a rubber stamp from. I'll never forget. In my capacity as senior counsel, I was consulted by a well-known company listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, where one of the executives was given the job of finding a building for their new head office. And they gave him, the company had given him the authority to buy it. And he bought this building, but it found they couldn't lay optics in the building, and they couldn't get it in for the computer age we were entering into. And who got the blame for it? The board. Not
because they had approved it.
Not Mr. X, who they'd given the authority to go and do it. And a very good example. You can't delegate that and not forget that you've got the responsibility, so you can delegate. Now, if he brought back to the board, I would assume at least one or more of the directors were asked, but we're going into the computer age, is this building ready for optic fiber, etc., etc.
So you mentioned that, as you say, going into the computer age, you were chairing an organization, a company that did a massive technology transformation, didn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, we had Waverley Blankets was.
Oh, I'm talking about another another company. I think it was at Brait
Yes,
that you was chairing.
yeah, after the frame group. I chaired Brait, which became the biggest private equity company on the African continent. In our first capital raising, we raised $420 million US. I'm going back to,
Wow.
I think it was 1998.
Did I read in your book there that there was a big IT transformation there?
Yes, absolutely.
And so now you had to learn all about IT, and to chair something, you really have to know the topic, right?
You have to understand it.
And tell us a little bit about that transformation.
Well, it took a lot of learning to carry, and as you know, I'm still there. And you are an expert, and I don't regard myself as an expert at all. But you have to learn these things, and you have to familiarize yourself with them. And otherwise, I don't think you're making a proper contribution at the board level. So you've got to get your head around these things and start realizing. I mean, try and run a company today that not using computer-aided issues. I was telling you about Waverley blankets. I always said we made them too well. And I'll never forget my mother-in-law went to them for lunch on a Sunday, and I saw hanging on the washing line a blanket. And I looked and I said, oh, this is a Waverley blanket. It's made by the frame group. My mother-in-law said to me, yes, we got it as a wedding present. I said, how long have you had this blanket? She said, 42 years. So, and I said, how often do you wash it? She said, once a month. Well, if you wash a blanket once a month and it lasts, it means you've made it too well. And we did. We made Waverley blankets too well. They lasted a long time.
Mhm.
And to draw the various designs that we had on blankets, it took artists ages to draw it. And then it went through a system on the top where the threads went through, and then the weaving machine and its pattern. But with computer-aided design, we had, I think, at least 17 artists drawing these things on there. It came down to one IT person.
Wow.
And so there was all this transformation that went on in correcting the frame group.
Pretty much every aspect, because then now you've got new internal controls as opposed to everything, every aspect.
Absolutely.
At any point,
There was the head office structure, I called it. I had a picture behind my office in Pinetown, and it showed that the head office structure, we had about 92 companies in the head office structure. And what Mr. Frame did, they each had different year ends, which meant paying of tax was at a different year end. But he had about 30 people invoicing and invoicing. So I showed the structure behind it. It looked like spaghetti, in a bowl. And I had to go through cleaning that up and just cleaning the structure. So you had the whole go into subsidiary Waverley Blankets, for example, and other things, property company, etc., etc. And so you had to learn these things. And the other interesting thing was, I'll never forget that my paternal grandparents had a little farming lot in Clarence in the Free State. And those Lesotho horsemen used to ride around with their Waverley blankets on their back. And I was thought, beautiful blankets. Little did I know one day that I'd be the chairman of the company making those blankets. And
wow.
yeah.
Did at any point did you feel that you had to be autocratic to make sure that change happened, that things were realized?
Not autocratic, but you had to be hard. I mean, I actually terminated the employment of two of the nephew and a son-in-law of the late Philip Frame, their employment. You can imagine that scenario. But I had to do it. It was hard, but I had to do it because they just were not competent and not doing. They were there because Philip Frame, they were family, and it was despotic, and I wasn't having it, and it couldn't continue. It wasn't right.
Mm.
So,
To just jump, yeah.
It wasn't easy, but you had to do it.
Mm. To jump to another example, with the First Rand Group, there was you were dealing with mergers there. That was significantly different, and it was all financially related. Did you find that you carried any of the skills from the Frame Group through to that? Did any of those aspects that you learned equip you for that?
Carolyn, it carries me through till this day. Even in the GGA. With the learning experience, I think that very few people have the opportunity of having that learning experience. You know, to transform a huge organization like that, and that you learn things, as I said, you couldn't learn but passing 3 or 5 MBAs. So it actually carried through your life. It doesn't leave you.
And
Wonderful.
What were the differences? What new things, besides the actual industry, what new lessons did you learn through a merger as opposed to a, almost internal transformation?
Well, what I learned is that you can have a merger, which is, let's say, equal equity merger, but there's always a dominant party. That you never have a situation where you have equality in a merger. This always comes through a dominant party. So you've got to look at the aspects of and what you're integrating and what you want to preserve, that you actually have to write in that agreement of merger, because if not, that dominant party takes over and things change. And there has never been involved in a merger where there hasn't eventually been a dominant party in that merger. And so you've got to think beforehand what will happen, when that party becomes. And somebody just put a merger of equals as a myth, and it's absolutely right. It doesn't happen. There's always a dominant party comes through.
Promise asks here, in the path of trying to achieve transformation, can a CEO who is independent in conduct remain a chair of the board or of the audit committee?
No.
No.
Certainly shouldn't be the chair of the audit committee. And he should be the chair of the board, because he needs that confidant to talk to all the time. And it can only be the chair, not even his fellow directors sometimes, because maybe he's got a problem with one of his fellow executives, not director, his fellow executive. And that did happen. Walter came to me and spoke about the incompetence of certain people and blah, blah, blah. So we had to deal with that.
A question from Colleen, can you kindly share your views and experience on the need for a chair to be particularly experienced in the industry in which the organization he or she chairs operates in? And I think you've answered a bit of that.
You don't have to be experienced in it, but certainly you have to be inducted very carefully. You've got to be absolutely clear before you accept that position. You understand the business, that you believe you can add value to chairing that company. And if you don't understand the business and what it's about, well, you just don't take the appointment. If you take the appointment and you've got no understanding what's happening in the business and you're not properly inducted, well, I'll tell you now, you're going to make a mess of things.
Margot asks, was it an original strategic goal to create a property business, or did that emerge as an option while you were there?
That's a good question, because once we had got rid of, from Blantyre down to East London and all over the place, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and got rid of those properties, we were left with these massive properties in South Africa, in Johannesburg, in East London, in Port Elizabeth, and what do we do with them? I said we need someone to actually focus on this. We need a property man to focus that expertise, and I got a property expert to become the chief executive. We formed a separate company, and the separate company then drove those properties and carved some of them up into little warehouses and let them. Some were carved up into apartments, some were sold off as big warehouses, but it became a property business and a very successful one.
So it wasn't part of the original intention. It just...
No, it came down to we got rid of all the properties in Zambia, Zimbabwe, and all over the place. We left with these properties in South Africa. What we were going to do, just sell off the warehouses. I mean, you get rid of those big warehouses that can take a Boeing. How do you do that? You know? So we actually got a property guy to become the chief executive and drove it, and he drove it as a property business. And so we had strategic goals. So this factory is going to be carved up into little warehouses. This factory is going to be made into apartments. This factory that, and this factory that, and it became a real business and the property company, and it became successful.
Here's one. You've got experience, as you mentioned, with tariffs. So how do boards navigate, this is from Nanda, navigate the direction, the company's direction and strategy with the current tariff and trade wars between the US and the rest of the world, especially company supply chains and markets? I wonder if you can answer that.
The answer is with difficulty because of the unpredictability of what is happening. Now, it's very interesting that Mark Carney has just become the Prime Minister of Canada. And I happen to know Mark because I was working in London with inter alia Prince Charles, creating the International Integrated Reporting Council. And I met Mark as then Governor of the Bank of England. And he made a speech about the tragedy of the horizons, that there was tragedy lying ahead if we didn't conduct business properly. And I used that in a speech that I made at the Guildhall in London. And Mark was in the audience, Mark Carney, and I used it. I said, the tragedy of the horizon. And imagine the tragedy if we continue with the primacy of the shareholder and profit, even though it's being subsidized by society and the environment. Where are we going? And property business at the junction of the economy, society, and the environment. You've got to make decisions through those three prisms to get sustainable development. And we've now got the development goals, and are we going to achieve them? And we should be thinking about them. And the limited liability company is, to me, the most important citizen in every country in the world, because it is the platform for which capital is raised, Carolyn, all over the world, and where jobs are created all over the world. So the concept of companies goes back to 1652 with the Dutch East Indies Company, but really became crystallized between 1840 and 1855 in the United Kingdom, when the Limited Liability Act was passed in 1855. But you had this tremendous opposition to it from the clergy, saying, who are we to create a person? And the Almighty can create a person. And because what the law does in the limited liability, you actually create this legal person. And it is a person in law. But it's got no mind, no heart, and no conscience. You and I as directors speak on the heart, mind, and conscience. And that's why people often ask me, but who do you report to? Don't you report to the shareholders? The answer is no. You don't. You report to the company because that's your principle. And you are the heart, mind, and conscience of that company. So you report to the company and through the company to all the stakeholders. including the shareholder. So the principle of the primacy of the shareholder and not thinking of the needs, interests, and expectations of other stakeholders was unfortunately went from the middle of the 19th century right through the 20th century. But we ended up with a degraded planet as a consequence, and society suffered. And so even when I still practiced as a senior counsel, I was involved in a case, for example, where people clocked in at this manufacturing company. Funny enough, it was a clothing manufacturing business. Now, if you deal with cotton, the fiber rises. It's so fine, it rises, and it sticks up in the ceiling. And if there's a wind or something, they start rubbing together, it actually starts becoming inflammable. And a fire broke out, and the chief executive made sure his workers worked there 8 hours because he locked the doors. As after when the doors were locked. And 3 people were killed, but 2 were burnt and 1 jumped out of the second floor building. And so that's an example how the contribution that society made. And you can go on and on with horrific stories about how society subsidized that increased profit, believing it was you had to increase the profit, and the criteria for success was increased profit, increased share price, increased dividends.
So Mark Carney's speech was revolutionary at that point.
Tragedy of the horizons, and I used it often. And Mark was in the audience once when I used it to say it's absolute. We don't get this integration of the financial and the non-financial together. We're going to have the tragedy that's already, it's here. It's not on the horizon, it's here. It's happening. Planet is absolutely degraded. Society has not treated them in order to reduce costs, for example, child labor. So you have humanitarian issues in that social framework. And these things had to change. And so I had all this experience when I was appointed as chairman at the United Nations on governance and oversight. And there I learned much more of what was happening. So when I was in 1992, I was asked to draw a code of conduct for directors in our new country from unequal opportunity to equal opportunity. I knew to myself that if I came out with a code based on the primacy of the shareholder, it would, in today's Bell Pottinger language, be seen as white monopolistic capital and would have been rejected. So I had people on my board, which was representative of our new nation from a racial point of view. But I had some of the diehards on the board as well. And I had to, they unwittingly became turned around into thinking about the needs, interests, and expectations of the stakeholders. And I did it on a basis of fairness, that when you make a business judgment call as a collective mind, in the best long-term interest of the company, you're going to prefer one stakeholder above another always. And they have these trade-offs. Every year you're going to have a trade-off. And next year, that one with benefit is going to benefit, it is not going to benefit the next time from your decision. You have to make that decision. If you get it right in the best long-term interest of the company, eventually it's in the best long-term interest of those stakeholders as well. Right? I think you get that longevity. I mean, companies used to exist for 30, 40, 50 years. Today it's 6, 7 years, Carolyn. Listed companies. That is frightening and worrying. And
especially, as you say, where its origins come from.
Exactly. And so value creation has become a critical thing. And shareholders are not owners. I mean, it's amazing. I did this work with Harvard University, and
that's a whole nother discussion on Harvard.
Yeah, and we did fantastic work. It was that we came out with what are the attributes of ownership. The ownership is you can, if you own a pen, you can break it, you can throw it away, you can give it to me, you can do what you like. But as a shareholder, can you go in and take a pen out of a company and give it to your child to use? The answer is no. Why? Because it's an asset of the company and it's a theft. You've just committed a theft, even though you are the controlling shareholder. You commit a theft. So you've got none of the attributes of ownership. And yet, right through the 20th century, we looked at the shareholders as the owners of the company. And they were preferred above other stakeholders, which has caused extreme harm to society and to the planet. And so it just had to change. And so I willfully changed it, and we came out with the first report in 1994, which said you have to take account of the needs, interests, and expectations of your stakeholders in making business judgment calls, but in the long-term best interests of the company. It is a matter of fairness. You had to be in a position to explain to a stakeholder why you'd made this decision, which was harmful to him, her, or it, and maybe in the next year.
And that's what you had to do with the frame group.
And you've got to have this ability to explain the fairness of it. And why, if you get it right, it's in their long-term best interest as well, because then you get longevity in the company. So
we've gone over time. There's just so much more to ask. I see a fabulous question by Charlie's Helps. I wanted to ask a question around, what do you do after your 14 years? How did you know to step down? But we've run out of time. So we are going to have another session as part of our Taking the Helm series of webinars with you, and we'll ask those questions then. But thank you very much, Prof. King, for joining us today. Everybody I see, yes, has loved it. And online. And we are actually going to have a fireside chat with you next week with Dr. Danny Davis, where we're going to be talking about integrated thinking that you came through your International Integrated Reporting Council. And Future Better is the name of the webinar next week. So we'll see everybody else online then, and I will see you in that fireside chat. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And we'll see you next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Carol.